Hey guys, this is Naudi Aguilar at Functional Patterns, and welcome to the latest installation of the Dogma of the Week. For this week's video, I'm going to be discussing CrossFit and the damaging effects it can have on the human body if it's done over a sustained period of time. I could go on several different topics in terms of what I don't like about CrossFit. I'm going to put more videos up in the future discussing what I don't like about it. But for right now, I'm just going to discuss a few biomechanical things that I don't like about it just for this video. So stay tuned in the future because I will be putting up some other content. Before I start this video, I kind of just want to discuss my background and where I started in the fitness industry so you guys can at least make it somewhat tangible in your mind what I'm trying to communicate, because I find that there can be a lot of confusion when I say something's potentially obsolete or when something's bad for you. So I kind of want you guys just to understand where my background was. When I first started in the fitness industry, I fell into a gym where I had a bunch of people that were very analytical about very specific things, and they wanted you to focus on perfection with everything that you did. Everybody around me, I landed into a very, very good group of people, and if you did something that was for nonsensical reasons, you would get called on it in 2 seconds. Somebody would say that, and it would make you out to look very foolish if you didn't do the exercise that you did for a reason. So at that point, it told me that if I was going to do any exercise, it needed to be for a purpose. Otherwise, I was going to get alienated by that crowd specifically there. And fortunately, it was kind of built a foundation for me as a trainer in terms of how my thought process was from that point onward. And so pretty much throughout this entire time of me learning more about the human body and how it's supposed to be conditioned, it was kind of more, mistakes were made along the way where somebody would see me and they would be like, yeah, after our last workout, I felt like my shoulder was a little bit sore. And so they would say that, my knee is a little bit sore. And they would start telling me these things every once in a while. It wasn't very frequent, but for me, it still aroused some type of concern, because if that's the case, if I'm the culprit for those types of pains, I just always thought, well, what could potentially happen in 2-3 years if that pain persisted? So I started investigating, studying more about my anatomy, studying more about the nervous system, going and really, really trying to figure out the root of what most imbalances were, so that way people wouldn't have pain when they would work out with me. As a result, you guys see the exercise, the library of exercises and in terms of techniques of myofascial release, corrective exercises, catabolic exercises. I have a wide span of everything, but that was kind of a building process from me trying to do things the right way. Now, when I look at CrossFit, I see a lot of corners being cut in terms of how they train. It's kind of like, if you think about it, if they have a person who's never been raised and who wasn't nurtured in an environment like I was, and they get a certification in a weekend, and then they're doing something like a deadlift or a power clean or something along those lines, teaching that it can already be a dangerous thing just by itself. But what becomes more dangerous is that even in optimal situations, when you do CrossFit, it is not going to be advantageous. I know there's people that'll say that there's good CrossFits out there and there's bad CrossFits. For me, I define the blueprint as already being flawed at its foundation. Main reason being, because human biology works contralaterally. We are bipedal organisms. If I rotate my body like this, it means that the most important plane of motion I should probably be training for my human biology should be the transverse plane. That's the mastery of what I should focus on if I'm looking for specific biomechanical function that applies to reality for my body. So if you look at, let's say for instance, if you had a kangaroo, if you trained a kangaroo in CrossFit, then you know what? If a kangaroo could potentially do CrossFit, then yeah, it would make a lot of sense for that kangaroo to do that, because a kangaroo travels in its locomotion cycle where it's actually walking and going into how it moves. It moves in the sagittal plane. However, the human being doesn't work that way. And a lot of times I find that people, it's hard for them to grasp that concept because they've never probably heard this from anybody before. But the main thing that I found out of training people who are Olympic athletes, I've actually trained people I had a guy who was a power lifter that I trained who was an Olympic athlete who attended one of my seminars. After training fighters, after training trainers upon trainers, I found that most people have had a complete disconnect with what I would call right here, the trunk, rotation from the trunk, or really rotation from the T-spine. Very few people have this instituted correctly when it comes to their movement. So oftentimes what they tend to do is overlook that transverse plane because they're so fixated on doing so much sagittal plane movement. So really what I want you guys to think about is that all biology needs to be conditioned towards its characteristics biomechanically. Dogs walk on all fours. Birds fly with their wings. Humans walk on 2 feet, they move contralaterally when they're in movement. This is how we have functioned for millions of years. So if you do not cater to that, specifically, you're going to begin to see deficiencies that pop in when you start doing physical movement. So let's say, for instance, if I did CrossFit over and over again in the sagittal plane and I continually did deadlifts with my feet pointed outward, or if I did some kind of power cleans with my feet pointed outward, within time, since I trained my body in this context, I'm going to lose a connection of, let's say, a specific system called the anterior oblique system. And the anterior oblique system just consists of muscles right here. It's almost like going to be like a sling, like when you throw a ball. This anterior oblique system is responsible for most of your efficiency in terms of human movement. And when you don't train rotation, within time, you degrade the capability of doing that type of range of motion when you're involved in movement. So when you run, that anterior oblique system is absolutely crucial for you operating efficiently. So if you're a runner, if you're a baseball player, or if you're just trying to stave off lower back pain, if you never learn how to rotate right here into your trunk and how to activate that anterior oblique system, you're gonna be in for a whole world of hurt. So going back to the CrossFit, they train nothing along those lines. So eventually what ends up happening is that they'll freeze this range of motion. None of this is going to happen. This gets completely frozen, and then within time, you're gonna start seeing where those femurs begin to point outward, where they'll get that kind of like that duck walk position, and you'll start seeing articulations of your joints going all over the place. Couple that with that when they train in the sagittal plane, they're adding stress along with that. When you start running yourself, let's say if you trained in CrossFit and you start sprinting, well, your brain is going to memorize all the stress patterns that you created when you were hitting a deadlift or when you were hitting a power clean, when you were in those fight or flight situations. So if you continually train in that sagittal plane and you do it under a stressful context, within time, your body is going to fall apart. And I know there's not too many statistics out there, but I actually read something where it was a small study where they were talking about 73% of CrossFitters actually getting into injuries. And I would imagine even under ideal circumstances, that number would not change too much, because the minute you begin to get stuck in that sagittal plane is the minute you begin to ignore your human biology. We are supposed to be here. I am going to reiterate this one dogma of the week after the other, because nobody seems to focus on the fact that we are transverse plane creatures. If you still don't understand that, when you swing a baseball bat, transverse plane. When you swing a tennis racket, transverse plane. When you kick a soccer ball, transverse plane. When you throw a kick like a fighter, transverse plane. A punch, transverse plane. We see this rotational dynamic happen everywhere. And sometimes people will say that if you just build thoracic extension, or if you train your body to move somehow through a deadlift, that automatically these dysfunctions of lack of rotation are going to disappear. From what I've seen and the thousands upon thousands of hours that I've put into trying to develop rotation, I've never seen anybody institute a proper transverse plane movement, and that's part of the reason why, if you guys see back here, I have all this geometry to help me figure out what transverse plane movement is supposed to look like. So hopefully that adds some clarity as to my particular disdain with CrossFit and how they overuse the sagittal plane. Bottom line, it just ignores human biology at its foundation. And I'm going to repeat this over and over again, even to the point where it's redundant, because I'm just trying to plant seeds right now. I realize with a lot of people, this hasn't really ingrained deeply enough yet, but I'm just trying to plant seeds. Humans are supposed to do transverse rotation. That's the bottom line. If you do not master that plane of motion, you are not going to articulate your joints correctly when you involve yourself in a sport, or if you're trying to get out of pain or sustain a workout regimen without being in pain. It all leads back to the transverse plane. It's one of the last progressions a human should have. So if you have an entire training system, again, focus on sagittal plane function, it's eventually going to have its drawbacks and it's eventually going to fall apart. So I do hope that you guys found this to be informative for you, and hopefully you'll start to be able to make some adjustments in your training. If you're wondering what the alternatives are to a CrossFit, I have all kinds of stuff on my YouTube channel. Just do some research for about 2 hours and you'll find plenty of alternatives to what you would find specifically for CrossFit. Until next time, this is Naudi Aguilar reminding you to live intentionally and not habitually. You guys take care.